I'm glad all of you have joined the session right now. We will obviously be very open to having more participants later on as well. And I'd actually request if we have any questions during the process, we can write them out in the chat column where I can try to address those questions right towards the end. So my name is Samar Naqvi and I look after programs at Now PDP. And today I will be speaking of the largest minority group in Pakistan, which is persons with disabilities, and understanding them. I hope everyone can view my slides as well. Okay, so one of the biggest hurdles that persons with disabilities face in Pakistan is that statistics go against them. According to the census in 1998, the prevalence of disability was noted to be about 2.5%, roughly making 3 million of the population, a conservative figure based on a weak questionnaire and very crude data collection methodology. A surveyor, for example, would knock on people's doors and ask the first person who opened the door in Urdu, "Khuda na khasta, aapke ghar mein koi aisa shakhs hai jo mazur hai?" The question roughly translated in English would be, "God forbid, do you have a person with a disability in the house?" And I'm saying person with a disability because I want to tone it down for appropriateness. So in actuality, if a question of that nature is posed, we understand what the results could mean. In 2017, the same sort of census was carried out with a similar sort of methodology. And in addition, there was another thing, which was a failure to incorporate a box for identifying or recognizing disability until much later, after a few campaigns were launched in the midst of the data collection. What resulted was an even lower estimate of less than 1 million people with disabilities living in the country, which means 0.47% of the entire population. Seems almost regressive after the years and years of work for the rights of people with disabilities across the globe. It was a systematic flaw where an underrepresented population could be ostracized and ignored completely had it not been for some of the private sector organizations and some enterprising individual change makers and opinion leaders that allowed for some acknowledgement of the severity of the matter and some continuation of the momentum on disability inclusion. The actual figure based on estimates is actually much more. More than 15% of the world's population are persons with disabilities, which means about 1 billion people. 1 in 7 persons is a person with a disability according to the UN WHO. Additionally, 80% of that population resides in developing countries. And as such, according to that, there could be as many as 27 million persons with disabilities living in the country. So from what we were initially estimating due to the census, 3 million, and now less than 1 million, to an actuality of about 27 million people with disabilities could be living in the country. Our existence as the network of organizations working with people with disabilities in Pakistan, Now PDP, a disability inclusion initiative since 2008, it has been created to address the rights of the largest, most inclusive minority group in Pakistan, people with disabilities, where all ages, all genders, all ethnicities, nationalities, religions, socioeconomic levels are all represented. I'm gonna go through a video just now. I realize some of you are on your phones and might not be able to hear this properly, but this is a brief introduction on Now PDP, and I'll proceed from there, speaking about what today's session is going to be about. All right. So again, I was just reading through the chats. I'm not sure if everybody heard the video just fine. I will try to for the next videos also debrief a little bit right after so that the videos can be made clear. This was a bit of an introduction of Now PDP, what we've done so far, and what we do for people with disabilities and their inclusion in society. Today, my choice of topics are the following that appear on your screen. In the next few minutes, I will be talking about understanding disability, its meaning, the facts around it, legislation about disability in the country as well, understanding persons with disabilities, what the perceptions are and what the reality might be. I will then go over briefly of a pilot study and the learnings from it, including that from the societal and institutional end, their behavior with persons with disabilities, and on the other side, the learnings from the outlook and perspective of persons with disabilities as well. We will then try to integrate the findings together and share what we do in terms of including persons with disabilities. And this will be followed by an understanding of what we can do, you and I, how we can continue the momentum or act at a personal, organizational, and a societal level. All the way through, again to repeat, you may put questions in the chat column, which I will try to address towards the end. But to keep these next few minutes interesting, I will try a mix of thought pieces, some real experiences and stories, and some reflective activities. I'm hopeful that you all will emerge with a slightly altered, more aware take on disabilities and persons with disabilities after the session. So, all right, what is a disability? What does it mean to you? Just reflect on this word a little bit, and the images below kind of indicate the types of disability that might exist. So how we look into disabilities is dividing them into 5 major areas: physical impairments, visual impairments, intellectual impairments, speech impairments, which are normally coupled with hearing impairments, and finally hearing impairments. So these 5 types of disability, but if we were to actually define disability, what is it? You may have thought about it for a little bit, but I'm also going to narrate what the National Policy of Pakistan 2002 says. It defines disability as the lack of ability to perform an activity in a manner considered normal. So we keep calling ourselves this word normal. What are we trying to imply? And who decided that the way we do things is normal and not the way persons with disabilities do things? Who decided that we're normal and they may not be? Just to question this word, I'm going to go over a video. It's a really short video. You might want to pay close attention. I will also debrief right towards the end. It doesn't require you to hear the sound as much, but just if you look at some of the visuals of the video following, we can then talk about this word normal. All right, so I'm not sure how many of you understood what was in the video. Just to be sure that everybody understood what it was, I will debrief, but since it's so short, I can play it one more time. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the video a little bit. If you noticed, there were people with disabilities in this world in majority. So this world that we just saw a glimpse of was made and operated by the majority, which were people with disabilities. And in this world, the people without disabilities, we who are call ourselves normal, might not be feeling so normal. As we saw, there's a woman who goes in to open a bank account, but the teller speaks sign language only, so she can't understand. Another place where one person is falling off while the others are moving around in wheelchairs very conveniently because the world was made by them. And third, we also noticed that the books in the library were in Braille, which is why non-disabled individuals couldn't read, but people with visual impairments could read just fine. So this is just to show a perspective that if the world were made by the majority, then it's obviously bound to create barriers for people with disabilities. So this world has those barriers. And there's a line that comes right towards the end, which says, may the world be made for you and access for everyone. This video actually shows and questions our notion on what is normal. So continuing on, the United Nations describes disabilities and persons with disabilities slightly differently. It doesn't use the word normal like the Pakistani policy. It says all persons who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various attitudinal and environmental barriers hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So the fact that United Nations uses the terminology persons with disabilities and at the same time speaks about a bodily limitation, a sensory limitation, yes, acknowledges that there is one, but it also suggests that disability only comes around when it is mixed with the attitudinal and environmental barriers. So if we were to notice, in accordance to the video, if we remove the attitudinal and environmental, the policy procedural barriers, people with disabilities might just be equal. Absolutely. So some facts that we speak about in terms of disability: 15% of the world's population, like we established, are persons with disabilities. 80% of them reside in developing countries, so countries like ours. 90% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school, which is why the global literacy rate for adults with disabilities is as low as 3%. and 1% in women with disabilities. The Pakistani population of persons with disabilities is around 27 million. That could be more than the population of Karachi. It's a big figure, but fact is that they are actually the most inclusive group in the world as well. We don't see them as often in the mainstream society, partially because we've created barriers. But if I were to ask you, if have you seen a rich person with a disability and a poor person with a disability? Have you seen a male with a disability, a female with a disability, a Balochi, Sindhi, Punjabi, any nationality, Pakistani, American, old person with a disability, or a baby with a disability? It cuts across all categories, and it really is agnostic of all these demographic categories that we just put out there. So ages, ethnicities, genders, religion, socioeconomic levels, everybody is involved in this group. And it is the only minority group that any one of us can join at any point in time. Scary thought, but it is a real situation. Now, based off of that, there were some standards and legislations introduced in the country. In 1981, the Pakistan Disabled Persons Ordinance came out, which was the first legislation on disability in its history. And can anybody remember why that was? What was going on in 1981? Ziaul Haq was leading the country, and he had a daughter with a disability. Which is why the ordinance was introduced, which said that 2% of people with disabilities will have to be employed at all organizations. The situation after devolution has changed a little bit, where each province has their own quota and percentage of disability inclusion. There is also the Accessibility Code of Pakistan 2006, which states the minimum requirements for all buildings for them to become accessible for people with disabilities. There is also the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Pakistan ratified in 2011. I'm sure everyone understands what the term ratified means. It means we signed up for protecting the rights of people with disabilities, providing an education to them, employment for them, equality, justice, non-discrimination, accessibility, you name it. All those clauses are in there. There is, however, minimal implementation of such, but these standards and legislations do exist in the country. Now let's reflect a little bit about what society feels about people with disabilities and what are some of the commonly used terms to refer to them. So I'll give you like a few seconds to think about this. What's the first thought that comes to your mind when you think about disability? So if I'm not mistaken, it could be bichara, bichari, it could be dependent, poor souls, pitiful creatures, unable to do work, all of those. And if we were to think about the terms and the sort of things that society says to people with disabilities, we might not even want to go there, because most of them are the things that we thought of that society feels about people with disabilities. If we were to think about them, most of them would be negative. What happens to their self-esteem? What happens to their worldviews? How do they grow up then, if this is what they're constantly receiving from society? I'm going to go over a few labels that persons with disabilities have to face, and I'll speak of each one of them and try to dismiss some of these for you as well. Victims or objects of pity. Are people with disabilities always considered victims? Aren't there famous people with disabilities who've achieved so much? They're also considered burdens or shameful for their families. I'm sure you've heard of this. Families with people with disabilities generally hide their children in their households, or are embarrassed to bring them forth sometimes, because they tend to become a shame to them sometimes. People with disabilities are also considered uncomfortable and threatening on occasion. which may or may not be true. Absolutely. There's so many people with disabilities like you and I who function absolutely well in terms of not seeming threatening at all, because they're individuals who work and educate themselves just like you and I. Unable to do things. Now, this is a label that goes around quite often, but again, so not true. Um, one of the greatest composers in human history, Beethoven, was deaf. Thomas Edison created the light bulb. Again, he had a hearing impairment. There's Stephen Hawking, there's Helen Keller, so many examples in the world of people with disabilities, not just doing things, but also inventing and creating things, paving the path for the future for all of us. The next is the assumption of multiple disabilities. I'm sure you've heard this so many times when we're interacting with people with disabilities. A colleague always mentions he has a visual impairment, and people often speak to him in a high tone. And he goes like, "Bhai, मैं सुन सही सकता हूँ, सिर्फ देखने का issue है." So we generally what we do is club categories of disability together, lump them together. So if a person has a visual impairment, we think he or she may also have some intellectual disability or some hearing impairment as well. They're considered childlike. Often we hear organizations, people saying, "Oh, un bachon ke liye bata do," or children with disabilities. It's also that they're adults. Some of them are adults. Above 18 would be adults with disabilities, not children. They're not always children. Or they not always do they need a patronizing or condescending sort of attitude. A one-dimensional homogeneous social group. Now, this is another thing. People tend to think that if one person with disability is a certain way, all of them are going to be that same way. We do that very often too, where we think that if one person has the inability to work or a bad work ethic, their team might be affected as well, and they're going to have a bad work ethic. So all people with disabilities have a bad work ethic, and then we categorize them and lump them together in one zone, which may not be true. They're humans just like you and I. So so if one of us is not that great a person, and the other one is a great person, with people with disabilities, a similar thing can happen. A word called special is also used very often. Special is a word phasing out in international literature because it's excluding, it's isolating. It's almost like we're saying we are people without disabilities, and these are special people. We're not even going there. We're trying to sugarcoat it. They might not be special. They might be wanting to be referred to as people with disabilities. Yes, there is a disability, acknowledging that, but not being treated specially, not all the time. Possess a sixth sense or supernatural ability. So this is again another label that goes around very often. People assume that if people with disabilities have a sixth sense, they might be able to pray for them. So one of our colleagues is constantly asked, he's a person with a visual impairment, he's constantly asked by people to pray for him. They say, "मेरे लिए दुआ करेगा." And he responds with, "भाई मैंने आपसे ज़्यादा गुनाह किए होंगे, मैं आपके लिए कैसे दुआ करूं, अपने लिए खुद दुआ कर लो." So it's not necessarily the case where people with disabilities are listened to more because they have supernatural abilities or they possess sixth sense. So a very interesting story. One of our colleagues, we were going to a training with one of our colleagues who has a visual impairment. And as we were going past a certain road, we were questioning, sitting at the back, as to where to turn left from. And this colleague with the visual impairment said, "Oh, the next left is where we're supposed to be." And we reached. So so we asked him what happened here and how he knew that we had to turn left. So he responded with, "Well, at this point in time, I could say that I have a sixth sense, and you would believe that. But in actuality, I just sensed the speed bumps on the road, and I know that the second speed bump means that we have to turn left and we'll reach the place. So they have their own ways. They've trained their other senses, and this is how they operate. So just to understand people with disabilities a bit more, the onset can be at birth or in development ages. This could result in a limited vocabulary or limited expression based on the disability. They grow up with weak communication skills because of lack of educational opportunities, and we have to realize that they've had very limited interaction with the mainstream and opportunities for socialization, which is why some of the things to remember would be that um, their ways of processing and sharing information might be slightly different from ours. So, for example, they hear with their eyes if they have a hearing impairment. So we must remember to empathize and not to sympathize, and use appropriate language and behavior, which we'll speak about in a little more detail later on in the session. You can try to understand more than you imagine. So for the next slide, what I need you to do is a bit of a reflective sort of exercise. I'm going to show the slide, and there are a number of words written on the slide. What you need to do is out loud, wherever you are, read the color in the word, not the word. So if, for example, the word says green, but the color inside is black, you must read the color and not the word. Okay? So if everyone's ready, I'm just going to go over the next slide. You have to say this in speed, and you have to say it out loud, and then we'll talk about it. The color, remember the color. Okay, so what happened here? Did somebody have difficulty while doing so? Or were there incorrect answers, or you couldn't do it in speed, or perhaps a combination of all these three? So what happens is that right now we're used to reading a word a certain way. So we're used to reading yellow as yellow as opposed to reading the color inside it. So we process words by reading them as opposed to reading the color inside them. But will that always be required? Is that the best way to operate? It's just the way we've been conditioned to operate, and it might not be the fashion that is always required. So similarly, people with disabilities may have processing difficulties because there is a certain norm that has been set. But who is to say that the way they process information is different, is incorrect? It might be different, but it's not incorrect. It might even be better on occasion. So, for example, you remember how when we're trying to concentrate on something, we're trying to read something, we try to close our ears, block all sound out so that we could focus with our eyes. Or if we were to listen to some really good music, we sometimes tend to close our eyes just to focus a lot on the hearing and to hear the music, to listen to it. So that is what people with disabilities are generally inclined to do. So some of them might have fantastic focus because they can't hear the sounds around them. So they might function and operate even better than us. So their way of processing might be better than us on occasion. So now I'm going to get into the most difficult part for me, because this is a short narration of what the actual facts are. There are some realities, and this is a story that I actually experienced firsthand, and I witnessed it. The fact is that there is a disadvantage for persons with disabilities more often than not, based on the sort of world that we've created around them. Things we take for granted aren't that simple for people with disabilities. Again, that is because there are barriers and difficulties placed in the society. Consider an instance where you felt disabled, or about your interaction with various types of disabilities. Names in what I'm about to say from here on will be changed for anonymity and confidentiality in order to protect the identities of the persons with disabilities in the narration. So starting out, I'm sipping a cup of my after lunch green tea, and I signal towards Amir, asking him my name sign. People with hearing and speech impairments normally assign a name sign to people in order to refer to someone very quickly. So instead of having to spell their names out with their hands, name signs are usually based on some very swift motions to save time and refer to somebody based on their prominent physical features, personality characteristics, or initials of the actual name. So if, for example, somebody has curly hair, they will signal curly hair to refer to that individual as opposed to signing their entire name. So name signs are assigned. We have a couple of colleagues with hearing and speech impairments at work, and Amir, the one I was signaling to, being one of them, started narrating some signs to me. And as some more colleagues poured into the boardroom, Amir and I are signing. He walks close to the whiteboard where everybody is writing what they want to know and eagerly asking him signs of various words that he's signing for all of us. Some signs are so obvious that they make us crack up. Some are so distinct that we're trying to draw conclusions as to how they even make sense. The color red, for example, is shown by pointing the index finger at the lips, indicating the color of lips, perhaps. We conclude that's why it may really be red. There is laughter in the air. Amir is looking at our happy faces, smiling and responding to each one of us individually and very quickly as well. From one end of the room, a voice cuts across the mouth. Can you all show me how to sign as well? It makes my heart sink. This voice is of Yasir, a colleague with complete loss of vision, his hands in the air, ready to be shaped in accordance to the sign. However, someone had to show him how, by explaining in detail how to readjust his hand position, indicating finger placement perhaps, and additionally, perhaps even physically aiding the process. If explanation is what it takes, in that moment, Amir could not aid Yasir. Amir couldn't even hear the request that Yasir had presented. This was the first time I had witnessed an interaction between two sensory impairments. And although we managed to remedy the situation, with another colleague standing next to Yasir to explain and help him with each sign as Amir indicated it, the fact of the matter was that in our excitement to learn, this had completely slipped our mind. I didn't realize that Yasir was there and he couldn't see any emotion. All he could do was hear everyone having a good time. I didn't realize that although Amir had meant for everyone to be a part of this, Yasir could not witness the sign language training. I didn't realize that even though Yasir and Amir wanted to interact directly, independently even, in that moment, they were unable to. In our petty troubles and at times in our moments of joy, we forget the basic troubles and struggles of individuals with disabilities. And the issue majorly is that we don't normally see people with disabilities or interact with them regularly while growing up. They're mostly seen in abundance as beggars on the street, which is why we have such difficulty in interaction. It's not so difficult though. And considering all of this, what we started out a few years ago was a very simplistic, very basic recruitment process where we used to place people with disabilities on jobs, and about 250 were placed somehow through personal contact or some requests, or this is and we were with the assumption that this would allow for a sustained livelihood for people with disabilities. They'll get to earn a living for themselves. However, this charitable approach to provide people with disabilities as a means of earning a living without preparing the organizations that they were going into was, as logic would have it, not so sustainable. The results showed a high turnover and a relegation to unrewarding roles and instances of attitudinal discrimination. So in terms of the institutions, they were highly unprepared. The organizations and the society would have negative attitudes towards the employment of people with disabilities, or they would have an overly sympathetic attitude. So for example, one person who was placed at a call center at one of the organizations didn't get, he was a person with a visual impairment, he wasn't given any work for the first few months. Uh, he, and they almost started questioning as to why this was happening. They were only keeping him to fulfill the quota or to feel good about it, because what they used to be like, nay, 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 don't go through the trouble. Oh, you don't have to go through the trouble. It was almost condescending, very, very sympathetic, almost like they would get guna for making a person with a disability work, which is so absolutely incorrect. They were joining those places to work, to actually be rewarded, to feel like they're accomplishing something, to be a part of the mainstream. And that wasn't happening. They couldn't get to raise their voice either. There were accessibility barriers. So some of the people with disabilities had to drop out of work because they couldn't go use the bathroom. The bathrooms were inaccessible, or nobody was hanging out with them because they were people with disabilities, and and others were afraid that this might be contagious in factory settings. So it was a lot of misconceived notions. It was a lot of attitudinal barriers, and there was no policy procedural help for them to raise their voices. And in addition, there was inaccessibility. So gleaning information from our experience and literature and carrying out our research, society's continued neglect and inaction towards the inclusion of people with disabilities was evident. Even the brightest minds would consider them a homogeneous group of individuals unable to work, reducing them to charity cases. Passerbys would even point fingers, express disgust, say toba toba, ask God for repentance. Um, they, they were seen as dependent, poor, pitiful creatures, alien and ostracized from society. And this is where one of Helen Keller's quotes comes to my mind, which says that science may have found a cure to most evils in the world, but it hasn't found one to the worst of them all, which is the apathy of fellow human beings. So we had to do something. We had to do something. We knew the institutions were unprepared. We knew that they required that help, that basic understanding of what disabilities are, what people with disabilities are, and the fact that they're equal contributors to society. What we, however, also wanted to know was the other end of it. With lessons learned, we made sure that our research was complete. Yes, there were issues with the society, and there was the ignorance and lack of attention, the apathy and intolerance. And yes, the institutions and organizations weren't equipped to handle matters with sensitivity and empathy, but persons with disabilities were also involved in this failed intervention. We carried out an in-depth study, and the results corroborated the findings of the placement project and stated that institutions were underprepared, but also highlighted that the perception and behavior of persons with disabilities was a construct of the societal attitudes that they had been facing. Findings indicated an unrealistic expectation setting in to persons with disabilities, a sometimes misplaced sense of self, and almost sympathy-seeking behavior that the society had instilled in them. In addition, they there wasn't a lot of education amongst people with disabilities as well, and they lacked some basic awareness of how to be in the mainstream. So the question, given all of these findings, was on the institutional front, how and why would they want to work with something of this nature? It is hard to imply first world concepts in a country like ours with systematic and structural issues, but there were corporate organizations, leaders in this area willing to work, and even though it took some convincing on some instances, it was a bold proposition, but uh, research and evidence pointed towards a number of benefits for the inclusion of persons with disabilities. The benefits included the fact that productivity and workforce morale increases the moment persons with disabilities are hired. Diversity and compliance is met. You meet all the legislative requirements. They're also an untapped resource pool with so many abilities that we haven't even reached out to and don't realize how much they can contribute to our work. In addition, the training costs and the turnover costs decrease substantially because there is retention and loyalty amongst this group of individuals. And one statistic that states that Pakistan incurs a loss of about $15 billion, about 6.3% of Pakistan's GDP, by excluding people with disabilities. So if we were to include people with disabilities, not only would we get these benefits, but in addition, we would be helping the economy. So now we had a remedy. Based on all the literature, what we've been doing for the past few years is working with education and employment. Now PDP works with people with disabilities to address the learnings that we came across. So promoting a realistic, healthy self-esteem, and to counter the severe lack of access to quality education for people with disabilities, we do vocational training, we do formal education, and we ensure that people with disabilities have an equal right at education as well. And we also do bits and pieces of skills development and soft skills training, and increase the awareness of people with disabilities such that they don't have any trouble when they're going into the mainstream and their expectations are aligned with what the organization requires. And on the other end, which is the bigger, the more difficult end, was the institutions, the organizations. The institution underpreparedness we try to address over these few years with infrastructural access. So we build out accessibility for people with disabilities at workplaces. We train the staff, we do sensitivity trainings, we do sensitization, we train master trainers at the organization such that a continuity to disability inclusion can happen. We address policy and procedural barriers and allow for access and people with disabilities to be able to raise their voice in the instance some sort of discrimination may be happening, and for them to grow and sustain their employment at the organization. And lastly, we also provide a pool of resources. So people with disabilities who are trained, skilled, and have the ability to work at an organization in accordance to their job roles. We have a database which we work with organizations on when they are incorporating themselves as disability inclusion pioneers and taking up this momentum of inclusion at the organization. So what we can do, coming right towards the end of our session, what we can speak about right now is how you can contribute. This is what we do as an organization, but you as individuals can also learn. You as individuals and at your organizations, at your schools, can really work on this movement on disability inclusion in Pakistan. You can become leaders. become disability confident. How are you going to do that? We engage with the organizations at a 5-day or a year-long level on disability inclusion, where we do complete training and understanding of disability, work on accessibility, we work on policy procedures, and for disability inclusion to be sustainable at each organization. Um, we also can become disability confident by changing a side perspective as well. By putting the person first and addressing people with disabilities by their name instead of their labels. Also by becoming disability positive, so using appropriate language. So some of the things that we can do is try adjusting our vocabulary a little bit. And using sensitive terms. So for example, instead of saying the disabled, we say persons with a disability. Instead of using words like MR, abnormal, and special, I don't even want to say the R word. Instead of using those words that we use very often, we instead can say people with an intellectual impairment. So instead of using crippled, handicapped, physically disabled, abnormal, incomplete, we can say people or persons with a physical impairment. Instead of saying normal, so calling ourselves normal, we questioned that earlier. Instead of calling ourselves normal, what we can say is we are a person without a disability. Um, so instead of referring to them as the blind, we can call them people with visual impairments. We can also call them a person who's blind. If they're using the term blind themselves, you can use this too. Instead of calling them deaf and dumb, I never understood the word. Why are we coupling dumb with deaf? They're not dumb. They're hard of hearing, or they can't speak, but does not necessarily mean that they are not smart. So instead of using those terminologies, what we can potentially do is say persons with a hearing impairment or persons with a speech impairment. And instead of using disabled bathroom, we can call it an accessible bathroom. There is another video that we can see just now and learn some appropriate behavior with people with disabilities. This is going to be a video that will educate us onto how to interact with people with disabilities. And this is one of your takeaways from this session as well. Okay, so again, I'm not sure how many of you understood the video and if you heard it just fine, but one takeaway from this could be the golden rule of philosophy. So what is said to be the golden rule is what this person said right towards the end, which was just treat us the way you would like to be treated, and we'll all be okay. It's actually really, really simple. Um, what else can we do? So we can advocate, spread the word, and start a change. We can contribute and support. We can volunteer. We can continue the momentum like some of these organizations that we work with already for disability inclusion. Um, and at the end of it, we can do some very, very basic things like learning sign language, like engaging with a person with disability, like joining platforms, um, like for example, even helping point out some accessibility barriers or some attitudinal barriers, or correcting our own attitude and correcting our own misconceived notions. We could also join this application, which I always find very interesting, called Be My Eyes. So this is where you join a community where you're helping people with visual impairment. So you're a community of people without disabilities, trying to help out people with visual impairments. Once you experience this software, this application, there's nothing like it, because you do your part and you feel like you do your part, even to a very, very small extent, by helping those who are facing some barriers in society. So right towards the end, I will be taking questions, but I just wanted to end on this one story that I always go back to, because it's hard to remain positive and idealistic when faced with constant roadblocks and dismissals and huge disappointments in this field. Disability is not a largely talked about or worked on topic in our country. We don't see a lot of participation in disability inclusion. So I'm glad whoever is joining right now or today and heard this is part of this, and can do more, can spread the word, and we need to talk about disability inclusion. So this story goes, there's a man on the shore with the sea in front of him, and there's multiple starfish lying on the shore, so in millions almost, and he's picking up one starfish after another and throwing it into the water, one starfish after another and throwing it into the water, so that they can breathe. A passerby comes along and asks what this person is doing, and asks him, there's millions of out there of starfish out there. Do you think this is going to make a difference? By what are you doing? This ain't going to make a difference. So the man picks up another starfish, throws it into the water, and says, well, it made a difference to that one. So imagine if we all joined on board, and if together we started placing the starfish in the water. Imagine the force, the potential, imagine the inclusion. I'm just going to conclude with this one line that one of our colleagues says, which is, बदलते हुए रवैयों से माजूरी खत्म नहीं हो जाती, मगर माजूरी का एहसास खत्म हो सकता है. So changing attitudes may not end the disability, but it may reduce the feeling of a disability. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to look into the chats as well. I believe there are some questions.